Good evening. Welcome to The Case for Cities, a 9-part monthly conversation series about cities. It's brought to you by the University of Cincinnati School of Planning, the Hale Foundation, and the Mercantile Library. I'm Laura Brunner, President of the Board of Directors of the Mercantile Library. If you aren't familiar with the library, we're a 185-year-old membership library located in the heart of downtown Cincinnati. Membership is open to anyone, even if you don't live in Cincinnati. If you're curious about us, visit our website and take a look at upcoming programs on this Crowdcast channel. It's a great lineup. By the way, the library is open, so we welcome you to stop by to join as well. Tonight we hear from James Johnson-Piett, founding principal and CEO of Urbane Development, a community development venture based in New York City, and my friend Bruce Katz. Bruce has been working with me at the Port, along with other community leaders here in Cincinnati, on ways to prevent the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black businesses and business districts in Black neighborhoods. After reading about James's work, I'm anxious to learn more from him and hear these two interact. Conrad Kickert, assistant professor at Urbane Design at the UC School of Planning, will tell you more about tonight's guests and the rest of the series. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the next hour.
All right, thank you very much, Laura. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you all to our conversation series that makes the case for cities. My name is Conrad Kickert, and together with my excellent colleagues at the School of Planning, the Mercantile Library, the Hale Foundation, and the Simpson Center for Urban Futures, we're so glad you could join us. It's time to talk. I'm sure you are as tired as I am of opening a newspaper, a website, or a social media post to read negative stories on cities. And the current COVID pandemic and our ongoing racial injustice has opened a new wave of negativity on cities as unsafe, unhealthy, and inequitable. And sure, cities have their challenges, but cities are not at the root of America's current social and hygienic crisis. They are their ultimate solution. In cities, we define and refine ourselves. Over the next 9 months, we want to share with you an urban glass half full of hope and of solutions for more attractive and equitable cities. Especially mid-sized Midwestern cities like Cincinnati have tremendous potential as places of choice and places of justice, where innovation and high quality of life, affordability, and unique culture can thrive if we play our cards right. 9 monthly conversations between national and local thought leaders will provide us with new perspectives and insights on how public space, transportation, housing, economic development, food, and nature can make our cities attractive and socially just. Sometimes our invited conversationalists are national or international, but oftentimes they are our local leaders. Sometimes they are academics like me. Oftentimes they are professionals. Sometimes they may even disagree with one another, and that's the fun of a conversation. All the times they deeply care for and believe in cities as our path toward human progress. If you haven't done so yet, be sure to check out all the conversations on www.thecaseforcities.org. We hope to rekindle our love for cities with you and to chart a course to prove and improve Cincinnati and cities like it. So tonight, we kick off our series with 2 leading national thinkers on the merits of cities, Bruce Katz and James Johnson-Piett. They will first take a step back and talk about why cities matter in general. What do cities do for us? Then we discuss the unique opportunities for mid-sized Midwestern cities like Cincinnati. During the second half of our evening, I will ask them a bit more about our opportunities and challenges. In other words, what can we do for our cities? Unfortunately, Bruce needs to leave us a little bit early, but we are open to audience questions for the final part of our evening. Please post these questions with the Ask a Question feature in Crowdcast, not the chat, but the Ask a Question feature in Crowdcast. Vote on which question you'd like to hear, and we can answer the top voted questions for you. And at 9 p.m., we will leave you with new inspiration and new insights. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you the first of our 2 speakers tonight, Bruce Katz. Bruce has an international reputation for recognizing how cities can improve our economy, our politics, and our quality of life. Among many other achievements, Bruce has advised the Obama administration on housing and urban development. He was the founding director of the Brookings Institute Metropolitan Policy Program, and he's the co-founder of New Localism Advisors, which helps cities design, finance, and deliver transformative initiatives that promote inclusive and sustainable growth. Be sure to check out his latest book, The New Localism: How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism, which describes how cities, not nations or states, are the true leaders and problem solvers of the next century. Bruce, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. And what I will talk about today is new localism, how cities can thrive in the age of pandemics. Are you getting a little feedback?
Yeah, you might want to, Bruce, you may want to just mute your own speaker.
Okay, where is that?
That's
I haven't
question.
used Crowdcast before.
If you just like mute your speaker on your laptop, essentially, just like, or turn your volume down, I bet you that'll help.
Maybe that's, okay, hold on, I'm sorry. Okay. We are having a wonderful moment here.
I think this is already improved. If you just like switch down your volume, you're good to go.
Yeah, I usually have the volume on the website. I don't see it here. Here we go. Nope, that doesn't do it. Okay. We are having a technological moment. Hold on.
Bruce, I'm great at IT support. So do you have a Mac or a PC?
I have a PC.
Okay. You have probably volume.
Oh, here it is. Hold on. I've never used Crowdcast before, and it is not letting me into the. Oh, hold on. No.
Yeah, just in your volume settings in the bottom right corner.
Yeah. Okay.
Just of your laptop itself.
Yeah. Okay.
I think this works, right? Oh no.
Oh no.
Wow, we're good. We're getting off to a real good start. Bruce, if you don't mind, I think you're frozen. Why don't we first talk with James, because we have two speakers tonight. So thank you. Yeah, and thanks for the comments. Yes, we have all been here. Right? We love the age of Zoom. So James, let me introduce you. So I would like to introduce James Johnson-Piett. Bruce, I'm glad you're unfrozen, but we'll get to you second. I'd like to introduce James Johnson-Piett. James has nearly 2 decades of experience in economic and community development, especially focusing on historically disinvested communities. As the principal of Urbane Development, a social impact agency based in New York and Philadelphia, James has helped over 1,000 small businesses and raised over $60 million in over 50 communities in North America and the Caribbean. His strength lies in connecting the dots of urban entrepreneurship, financing, development, and empowerment with a clear social mission. I very much look forward to your perspective, James. Welcome. So what I'll do on my end, James, I'll share your screen, and as soon as that goes, then you are good to go. Just give me a little minute here.
Well, in the meantime, nice to meet everybody virtually. Sorry, Bruce got caught up in the maelstrom of technology, but hopefully this holds up well for me.
Great.
Okay, are we good there? Awesome. So
I think so.
As Conrad said, I started Urbane in 2008. We are based in New York City and in Philadelphia. We build bridges towards equitable distribution of power and wealth. We foster community-led solutions through a place-based mechanism, research, advisory services, and investment. Through centering the wisdom and solutions already in communities, we aim to share a future of prosperity and shared wealth for the folks we work with. So really excited to meet you all, and let's talk about cities. Next slide. So I'm sure you guys, at the very least, if not heard about what happened last night with our debates. And so given that the tenor of this conference is supposed to be positive, I will say, what I learned last night, certainly around sort of thinking about cities, was the need for a future of brave nuance. I thought a lot about Rome and the fact that we've watched many cities collapse under their own weight, and oftentimes chaos becomes a change agent. But if it's used as a blunt instrument, it doesn't get you anywhere. At the same time, the safety of rose-tinted nostalgia that we often look to when we are in the midst of chaos doesn't work well when you need a future that needs that brave nuance. So for me, I feel like cities are the perfect incubator for that sort of both that brave and bold sort of focus on innovation, but also a need to really be nuanced and focused on, what the sort of complexity that looks like when you're trying to create an interesting sort of social system like a city. So next slide. So Conrad asked me to think about why do cities matter and what do they do for us? I think last night was abundantly clear in my mind why they would matter. Next slide. Oh, did the slide advance? Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So, number one for me definitely is diversity, and not just the more traditional ideas of diversity, but a diversity of ideas, of infrastructure. I think, thinking about last night again, cities are places where you can actually test the great American experiment. They are the places where you can continuously improve and really redefine what it means to be a patriot. I think oftentimes we take for granted what it means to be in a place where you can, have different sights and smells and different folks being able to connect with you. But, we think about the incubator of change that we're definitely going to need in our American sort of culture. Cities are the incubators where that's going to happen. So I think first and foremost, it's the sort of retrenching of what we already know, which is sort of the diversity that cities bring to the table, really are our strength. Next slide. Certainly, I think cities are the aggregators of ideas and skills. And so I'm really excited. I think Bruce can talk more about, Erie and streetcars, but, I'll talk at a more high level. Cities are very much the places where you aggregate ideas and skills. They facilitate an exchange of ideas. They're the places where you cluster and create and disseminate those ideas and those skills, and thinking about the mobility methods that you move along. Every great city that I can think of connects people throughout their entire metropolitan area, their whole metropole. You're able to move people, whether they're low or high income, whether they're working in manufacturing, or you're thinking about residential communities. How do you move through a place? Speaks very loudly about how that place is going to grow and how it's going to be able to influence folks as you move forward. And so for cities, especially, folks like yourselves in Cincinnati and other sort of Midwestern cities, this real interesting opportunity point to think about the new mobility. Where can you sort of move beyond the more traditional sort of car-driven infrastructure and think about multimodal technologies and ways to be able to move people through? It's not just about, carbon footprint, not just about changing, sort of the modalities there. It's about exchanging ideas and moving people through them. And if you're talking about just and equitable cities, connecting people who are typically, from an infrastructure perspective, frozen out from that idea exchange and being able to get them to the ideas and the skills and the jobs and the culture and the opportunity points as quickly and as sort of hopefully as efficiently as possible. So for me, I think mobility is a huge opportunity point for cities to be able to really sort of raise the bar again around how we sort of move ideas through our world. Next slide. So I hope you can see this picture pretty well. It's one of my favorite cities. Doesn't really exist. It's called Wakanda. So, for folks who are fans of Black Panther, what I think was interesting about that movie that's underrated was it reimagined the idea of city. It reimagined sort of fabric and the infrastructure of the city. At the same time, took the best parts of what we know of cities. But one of the biggest things it did is it made you re-examine the canon. And I think this is something that's super important for us as we think about how to challenge the status quo through continuous improvement. And so cities constantly have to do that. I'll give you three kind of quick examples. One, we think about what is beautiful, right? We think about design, what is sort of traditionally sort of efficient and from a form and function perspective, where does that come from? When you got to think about planner, I know this is talk about that. So for best and highest use, where do those constructs come from? Ideas of value, ideas of price, ideas of return. All these things that we take for granted are actually social constructs that we have to constantly re-examine based on where we are in our world and what are we trying to achieve in our world. And so in my mind, I feel like the really interesting opportunity for cities is how can you take, constantly thinking about what you want to achieve. What are the metrics of prosperity that you're trying to sort of get to from an outcome perspective? How can we validate and assess risk when it comes to our relationships and our sort of transfer of information? Ultimately, cities are the perfect container for that, around constantly trying to improve the sort of social state, through this sort of continual kind of examination of what is canonical. What is the sort of standard bearer? What is the sort of platform that you're building from? Next slide. So don't get mad at me. I think I got some things wrong. I tried to find who your finance director was, Karen Adler. I could not find a picture of this woman to save my life. But we're going to talk a little bit about civic innovation. And I'm sure Bruce is going to touch a little bit more on this, but I'm really excited to think about how does the city, and I mean from a municipal perspective, how can the city be the incubator for civic innovation? How can it use its dollars to be able to move things forward? So when we think about that, I have a client. I said I wasn't going to do this, but we have a client that we're working with who was trying to create a really interesting sort of line of hempcrete products. So thinking about industrial hemp as an example, as compared to your more traditional CBD or cannabinoid cultivars, thinking about much more hardy, commodified sort of hemp stock that you can use for seed, that you can use for oil, but mainly from a sort of herd perspective, you can use it along with lime to create a concrete replacement that is stronger, more lightweight, lasts hundreds of years, super breathable, and right now in many cities cannot be utilized because of our laws. But if you were to create things like hempcrete sidewalks, hempcrete steps, permeable pavements, I think we're dealing with stormwater, you have a whole new industry that you can build economic opportunity around. You can think about from a resiliency and climate change perspective. We're going to get that to a little bit later, but it needs the opportunity to be able to incubate. And we oftentimes don't think about the public sector being that investor. When oftentimes we think of many of our best creations in technology, they are incubated in the military, in our sort of science complexes for medical research purposes. These things are industrializing this thing. Absolutely, hemp could be used as fabric. Hemp could be used as textiles. Hemp could be used as packaging. Hemp could be used as all these different things. But when we think about natural materials like hemp, as an example of the ability to sort of see, can the retirement system of Cincinnati, thinking about both its current and its future opportunities, what does the city invest in? How can we think about new pathways to create new materials or new opportunity points to really be able to invest in the city, right? So whether we're talking about the literal physical infrastructure, like things like hempcrete, or we're thinking about, again, some of these other pieces around, think about our city's investments. Ultimately, your budget is going to tell you everything you need to know about your city's priorities and their strengths. And so really being able to dig deep and think about the ways in which civic dollars can be, frankly, low risk capital for the purposes of moving along innovation is really an interesting opportunity for cities for sure. Next slide. City states. So as you can see, I've been keeping up at night thinking about ancient Rome and other sort of city state constructs. I think one of the interesting things about where we are today is cities are going to have to really think about how they are marketing themselves to the world in and of themselves. And so whether you're Cincinnati, you're New York, you're Singapore, you're Shanghai, it doesn't really matter. At this point, as an actor, you're thinking about ways to reimagine and configure everything from your own supply chain, your global trade opportunity points, your knowledge exchange. You guys being American cities thinking about themselves as leaders of global policy and finance. So not leaning on the federal government, not leaning on other sort of entities to be able to speak for them, but very much being able to be the arbiter of their own future through, again, that same sort of opportunity point around talent, infrastructure, investment, and sort of vision. So for me, cities really being the opportunity there. It's really interesting. Next slide. So I love this slide. It's my hustle slide. End of the day, I think people go to cities, frankly, to learn how to be resilient individuals. This may be a small personal thing, but when people seek out cities to be able to sort of cut their teeth and sort of grow, in their own personal lives, oftentimes they're going there to really see if they can make it. I think what's really fascinating about cities, again, whether it's about entrepreneurship, we're talking about innovation, or frankly, you're just talking about making new friends and family. You oftentimes go to places that are different, that are new, that are uncomfortable. They make you work. Your cities can be lonely, they can be hard to penetrate and navigate, but they'll test your mettle and they make you work, and you become better because of it. I very much hope and desire that folks, young and old, recognize how much the city matters when it comes to people's own personal sort of journey and their vision going forward. Next slide. And with that in mind, I wanted to be a little kitschy here. My wife is at work right now, and so I'm not going to get a show for these. But people fall in love in cities, man. I met my wife in St. Louis. I courted her in Honolulu. We fell in love in Providence. We got married in Queens, and I made a home with her in Philadelphia, which is where I'm at now, by the way. So just to make that clear. But what you're seeing behind you is Providence and Bangkok, and I think every place that I've gone, whether it's my wife or other folks in my life, I've seen how important the city is to that sort of connection. The opportunity point, even especially now in the age of COVID, in the age of online dating, being able to have a place where you get that diversity, where you get that sort of, again, challenging the status quo, really stretching your legs a little bit around what you're looking for. I think cities are super important around the future of love, and really making sure we have a sort of diverse incubator to be able to find our mates. Next slide. So what's unique for mid-sized cities like Cincinnati? I'm really fascinated. I've never been. I've had colleagues work there. I have some really good buddies over working at Mortar. I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. But cities like Cincinnati, I think have a lot of opportunity points moving forward. So next slide. One is climate change. 100%. I think people don't think about climate change as an opportunity point, but it is. Whether you believe in the hype of it or not, the bottom line is coastal city. I mean, you can see what's happening in coastal cities right now. Fires and floods. It's really, frankly, making, from a long-term perspective, making them untenable. I think Midwestern cities have an interesting opportunity point to leverage that and think about them as alternatives in terms of places we can go. Again, the idea around reshoring and localizing supply chain, mitigating heat island effect, thinking about renewable jobs and renewable energy infrastructure. There's enough opportunity points around what climate change can mean for cities like in the Midwest to reposition themselves as places of opportunity in places that are going to really incubate the new economy for sure. And not the needle of Cincinnati, but certainly you guys are part of a 400 city kind of cohort that has taken on the Paris Accords, outside of the actual sort of country. The U.S. hasn't been able to do that. Cleveland and Columbus, are pushing this pretty hard. They sort of put a foot in the ground around signing the Global Covenant of Climate and Energy. So while Cincinnati is definitely a city that's also on that list, your competitors in Ohio are definitely looking at climate change as a way to sort of reimagine their cities. And I think Cincinnati is well served to think similarly in that vein. Next slide. Again, I'm not really telling you anything super new in this respect, but I will say you have a beautiful city. I spent a good portion of my night last night trolling various Google images to look at all the beauty of the architecture in space. What's equally interesting for me is, you have an affordable city, and you have a beautiful city, and I think you have an interesting opportunity and a mandate to think about how do you either A, preserve what you already have, or B, reimagine what can be. So whether it's public housing or affordable housing, manufacturing space, et cetera, the usual sort of design tends to be lowest common denominator. And I'll speak to this as a developer, trying to figure out how to keep things beautiful it's something that's really, really fascinating. And a city that has such an architectural sort of, infrastructure, Cincinnati, really taking that mantle on where you can be brave with your design, I think can be a really, really interesting sort of lightning rod around attracting people to the city, creating identity opportunities, and really just, creating a new narrative around justice. I think oftentimes for folks, you can oftentimes tell low-income housing just by looking at it. And I think the bottom line is we can make things beautiful. We can make things different. We can push the status quo around what is affordable and what is beautiful and how those things can interconnect. And I think cities like Cincinnati have a really interesting opportunity point to make a statement there. Next slide. In that vein, the other side of the coin is definitely adapting and reusing, infrastructure. This is the Buffalo Silos complex. I'm super excited about what they're doing over there. I can rattle off several other cities that have been able to really take their old industrial infrastructure and turn it into mixed-use property, mixed-use, activity spaces, et cetera. Again, Cincinnati has a lot of really great amenities, but thinking about your old adaptive infrastructure and how to reprogram it, whether it's going to be productive from an economic perspective, cultural or otherwise, these are the opportunity points to really be able to reinvent yourselves. Frankly, not even reinvent yourself. I always hate that term. To be able to let people know how dope you are through your old bones and your new ones. So last slide for me, I think it's 15 minutes. I'm trying to get you guys in and out. You can hear Bruce. So my last big thing is I think COVID also offered an opportunity for you. So I'm very sure you know what's going on the left and the right, but I'm going to try to get the chat to tell me who's in the middle. First person that could tell me who's in the middle gets the prize in the chat. I'll give you 5 seconds. Anybody? Who's the cat in the middle? This is one of your favorite sons. This is DJ High Tech. So I'm a Gen Xer. He's one of the main DJs of the sort of 90s sound when it comes to independent hip hop. And when I think about Cincinnati, frankly, I think about him first. And I think what's interesting right now is COVID has made cultural connections and cultural exporting way easier. I think about the party that you see on Instagram. There's been DJs who've made, frankly, millions of dollars setting up, exactly, high tech, setting up parties online. You don't have to be in Miami or New York, or any of the sort of more traditional sort of cultural centers to be, a superstar at this point, right? We know Fiona is cute and we know your chili is good, but you guys have to ID those early adopters, those informal superstars, the hood celebrities, the folks who you need to give a platform to, right? Because at this point, you're a YouTube, show away from being able to really be able to fly here. So I think, how do you think about the next decade for Cincinnati in terms of the culture? How do you be able to really, display your new talent, to be able to find that new set of cultural sort of touchstones, and really going back to that diversity question, to really show the full breadth and depth of what Cincinnati has to offer. It's a much easier time to do that than it's really ever been, because we're all online right now. So you get to kind of create your new destiny from that direction. So anyway, I think that's all I got. Happy to answer some questions after the fact, but give the mic to Bruce. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. I did not guess that either. So there's
all
that.
Right, look them up.
Okay, Bruce, are you there? Yes.
Okay. How does that
Bruce,
work?
This works. Is that better? Bruce, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you hear me? Just give a thumbs up.
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Because I can't hear you. Anyway, it's great to follow that presentation. Let me make a case for cities, but also bring it back to Cincinnati. So the general case was laid out in a book I co-authored with Jeremy Nowak, a close friend, that was published at the beginning of 2018. It was called The New Localism: How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism, as you mentioned. So this is a talk about how cities can thrive in the age of pandemics. And the fundamentals don't change. Cities are engines of economy for countries, and the world because they concentrate and co-locate and agglomerate all the assets that drive the modern economy. Centers of excellence, advanced research institutions, healthcare facilities, major corporations, leading advanced industries and sectors increasingly around the clean economy and the sustainable economy. Talent, not just folks who graduate from four-year colleges, but people who have the credentials and the skills to participate in the modern economy. Capital, quality capital, small businesses and entrepreneurs, and the support systems for them, incubators and accelerators, and support networks like Minority Business Accelerator in Cincinnati. Anchor institutions that when they work harder for the cities where they're anchored, buy local, hire local, invest local, locate local. And finally, innovation districts. Because even though we all admire the great stories of Steve Jobs in his garage, the way innovation actually happens in the real world is collaboration and serendipitous collisions. And when you have geographic density and the co-location of institutions and companies and startups and scale-ups and incubators and accelerators and investors and talent, that's when you have innovation. So cities are the engines of the economy because there are certain laws of the 21st century economy that have not been repealed by COVID. They've been disrupted, and they will continue to be disrupted. But if we want to continue the march of progress, cities are really the engines and the centers of global investment. They have the opportunity to be vehicles for economic opportunity. They have the opportunity to be vehicles for inclusive growth and equitable development. To achieve that requires a level of intentionality and purpose, particularly when the national government goes on a frolic and detour, is missing in action. The metaphors will just keep going. The most important thing about cities in the 21st century is actually not their economic prowess or even their substantial platform for inclusive development. It's their ability to achieve these things. Cities are not governments. Cities are networks. The federal government is a government. States are governments, and therefore they can be hijacked by partisanship, mired in political polarization, ideological polarization, and they often are. Cities are networks. Public sector for sure, private leaders, civic leaders, community leaders, university leaders, environmental activists, and across the board. Those individuals have a stake in their place. They get rewarded for action as opposed to obstruction. And the reason why cities over the last 25 years have not just become the vanguards of problem solving, but really the keys to unlocking the full potential of people, and also to deal with the hairy, audacious issues like income inequality and climate change, is because of this problem-solving possibilities. So when we think about the last 6 months, an enormous amount of attention has been placed on the national government. So when we have a crisis like this, a hurricane hitting every place in the country, ad infinitum, there is a focus on national governments basically providing resources. What I have found over the past 6 months is, first, cities were first to the table to provide relief for small businesses as they were affected by the public housing lockdown and economic contraction. And they were the ones left to deal with the public health crisis, right? Because the national government was absent. When the national government finally did respond with relief for unemployed workers, for small businesses, the way in which that response was channeled really depended on these networks in different places, and whether they were tight, whether they were coherent, and whether they had the capacity to basically carry out these national relief products. And finally, as we begin to prepare, hopefully, for life during a pandemic, post-pandemic, it's cities that are going to set the visions that are aligned with their own competitive advantages and their own distinct priorities and their own values. And then they will harness the energy from national government, for sure, but also private and other investors. Why does the Midwest matter? And why do cities like Cincinnati matter? They matter because this is where these assets come together. The anchor institutions are called anchor institutions for a reason. They're literally anchored in place. They are rooted in place. You can't just take centuries of development and centuries of progress and move it somewhere else. And you can't live remotely online ad infinitum, right? If you want to continue the kinds of problem solving that is so essential. Ultimately, we're going to have to do that with maybe social distancing for a period of time, but in cohorts and in concert. When I think about Cincinnati, what I think is so remarkable is not just advanced industry growth or not just reurbanization or things that are quite similar in other parts of the country. What I think is most distinctive about Cincinnati is a long-term, multi-decade approach to growing Black-owned business and ensuring that more and more individuals have the potential to take their entrepreneurial dreams and achieve them. Now, 30 or 40 years ago, how that played itself out was large corporations like Procter & Gamble, like Kroger's, beginning to use their purchasing power, the goods and services they purchase on a regular basis, and their hiring power to begin to focus on more diverse businesses and more diverse talent. And they are part of what's called the $1 billion roundtable, only a small segment of Fortune 500 companies that have committed to these kind of goals for a long period of time. As that has played itself out, other anchor institutions, the hospitals, the universities, have begun to focus on their campus development and bringing more Black-owned businesses along for the ride, right? Having them be the contractors, having them be pre-construction vendors, having them being post-construction vendors, right? Minority Business Accelerator, Mortar itself. Those are the support institutions, the intermediaries that help businesses toughen up their business plans, get access to quality capital, and ultimately grow and scale, whether they're located in a business district within the city of Cincinnati or in the county or throughout the metropolitan area. I think what COVID has unleashed and unveiled is a level of structural racism in our country that has essentially created large, long-standing disparities on income, health, and wealth. The only way we're going to move forward on these really long-standing issues is by upgrading skills, is by growing Black-owned businesses at scale. Currently, only about 2.2% of employer firms in the United States are Black-owned compared to 14% of the population. And then ultimately creating wealth for people, wealth for households, wealth for families, and wealth for communities. That is the way forward. It is what has not happened in the United States for a long period of time, even though there were many laws on the books, even though there have been a parade of programs over time. Ultimately, I fundamentally believe it's these ecosystems, these very tight networks at the local level, at the city level, that combine business demand, anchor procurement, supplier diversity on one side, business support so that businesses can actually design and tease out a strong plan for growth, capital, not just debt, but equity investments in businesses, a different kind of investment than currently exists, not just the venture capital from Silicon Valley, the vulture capital, but capital that allows businesses to grow at their own pace and ultimately regeneration of communities. So cities matter. They have mattered for millennia. The progress of civilizations is the evolution of cities. COVID does not erase thousands of years of human progress or in civilization. It will disrupt it. It will restructure it. It will require us to rethink physical space and ultimately to clean up the financial mess around commercial real estate and small business collapse after the fact. But we can do this. In other countries, frankly, because they acted with greater alacrity on public health, already moving beyond. So cities matter, they will matter. And I think the most important thing to say for everyone on the call is networks matter. The prosperity of cities and our ability to grow in inclusive, innovative, and sustainable ways will fundamentally depend on whether networks of leaders and citizens and residents can collaborate to problem solve.
Great, thanks very much, Bruce. So just a quick question to both of you, Bruce and James, is, James and I had a conversation before about brave choices. And Bruce, what you also bring up is the agility of cities, right? So the cities are not nations, they're not states, they're not governments as such. Could you give us a couple of examples of some of these agile or brave choices that a city like Cincinnati could make for us?
Well, I think, let me turn this down, the volume down again.
Thanks.
Hold on for one quick second. So the great thing about cities is they borrow from each other. And frankly, they steal from each other. So city leaders are always looking at other cities to say what's working either within your own country or beyond your own country. So a couple things that I think we can learn from the Nordics, from Denmark, Copenhagen, Stockholm, Helsinki, and some of the German cities. What they do when they organize is they don't think about cities all by themselves. So in the US, what we think about is what is Cincinnati going to do? What is Pittsburgh going to do? What's Toledo going to do? In the Nordics and Germany, they create consortia of cities that aggregate their market power and then navigate and negotiate with large-scale financial institutions, institutional investors like pension funds or large banks. And then they basically say, you're now dealing with the centers of the global economy. So what we would like to do is invest in clean energy. What we would like to do is invest in transit infrastructure. What we would like to do is basically enable the upgrading of the skills of our workforce to the jobs that exist in the 21st century. And then they begin for weak market cities and hot market cities to come in with pools and portfolios of projects and then create financial products that fit the city. So I think when we think about moving forward, the US does have certain things where we lead the world in many respects. The commercialization of research. The US is better than that, partly because we have invested so much in basic science and applied research. But when we think about many of the things that are going to propel cities forward, it can't be every tub on its own bottom. It's going to have to be cities acting in an aggregate, cumulative way so that we ultimately have the kind of financial instruments and investments that we require.
Thanks.
That's just one example.
Yeah. James, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we talked about earlier.
Sorry, Bruce, you might want to switch down your volume a little bit again. Okay.
Is this better?
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think what Bruce was getting at, particularly around networks, is really interesting. So when I think about the networks that are built around wealth, the key nodes are the gatekeepers that tie into that. So when you think about, if I'm going to invest in something that's going to be high value in the venture space, inevitably, you're going to have certain investment advisors sort of sitting in the middle of that space, asset managers, wealth managers, When you're thinking about city municipal bonds, you have the credit rating agencies in place. When you think about your individual personal finance, you have credit bureaus that tell you whether or not you're doing something well or not. Insurance underwriters, merchant payment elements. In terms of arts and culture, you have the folks who are the appraisers. There's appraisers across the board in many industries. I think cities can completely disrupt that gatekeeping infrastructure, thinking about what risk is as it relates to who is taking the risk on. Oftentimes, there's almost so much embedded sort of infrastructure in the investor class, yet the things that we're looking for around civic innovation are definitely very much about how do you get the individual to be able to invest in something that's bigger than themselves. So if I want to make an investment in my community right now, based on the SEC laws, I can't do that, for the most part, right? If I'm thinking about where the point I made earlier, where are cities putting their money? And I don't just mean in terms of their budgets, but I mean their actual deposits. What decisions are they making there? Are they deciding to put their money in black banks? Are they deciding to put their money in credit unions? Again, it's all these sort of system, sort of infrastructure points in terms of that network, where if a decision that changes at the gatekeeping point, if you decide to make a different decision, everything from that point forward completely changes. And if we're talking about the social networks that tie into that, so we talk about angel networks as a good example of this. Certainly in Philadelphia, where I am, we're in the middle of a study looking at equitable entrepreneurship in the city. And what we're starting to hear again and again is there are angel networks that exist in Philadelphia, but they aren't networked with the kind of black and brown entrepreneurs that need the capital. There isn't that social weaving that needs to happen that's there. And in the middle of all that are typically the folks who are the deal runners. They're the ones who are connecting the angels to the actual opportunities. You change who those people are, all of a sudden the whole world changes for folks. And so I think for me, the gatekeeping piece is a huge one. The point I made earlier around canon, as both I think Bruce and I both talked about sort of ancient society, how cities are the levers of progress for our human sort of society. These instincts that we have around what is beautiful, what is right, what is form, what is sort of canonical, they're social constructs that have to change and progress. And you have to work on that progression around what those things are. And so cities are completely the places where you're going to make that happen, both at a sort of hyper-local level and to Bruce's earlier point around the conglomeration of cities. How do you create, that kind of, I think, hopefully hyper-local regional kind of canon that will make places better because they're innovating and they're measuring themselves based on something that makes a lot more sense now than it did maybe 50 or 60 years ago.
Bruce, you were nodding. I thought, did you have any comment on that, on what James just said?
No, okay, I'm going to go back down again. Something's going on with the volume here. Can you hear me now?
I can. I can also hear a little bit of feedback.
I think it's spot on. Capital is really not the constraint in most cities. There's enough capital to basically fuel the startup of firms and the growth of firms. What's lacking is an ecosystem and of vehicles for moving the capital that exists into these opportunities. And so the greatest sort of challenge we have post-COVID, because the businesses that have been disproportionately affected by this are black and brown owned businesses, because they were smaller, they were underbanked, and they did not have access to essentially take the very one-size-fits-all financial products that were created by the federal government. So coming out of this, we have to build sharp, tight, connected, matched ecosystems, and to move the capital that already exists and actually wants to move in this direction to entrepreneurs and small businesses where they are, and to the communities where they disproportionately co-locate. I think we've been focused on the wrong end of the telescope, actually. We're saying it's a capital problem. I think we actually have a network problem. Cities are networks. We can solve this. The capital will flow.
So Bruce and James, both together, essentially, okay, you're talking about these cities as networks. first, but we are also seeing how networks, including in Cincinnati and many other cities, are incredibly disconnected. How do we bring these networks together? How do we bring the various groups within Cincinnati together?
Well, my view is you tend to need a goal that is widely shared, where there's a consensus across all these different divides we have. And then we do have lots of organizations in cities. I mean, cities are over-organized. Suburbs are under-organized. Let's just be clear about that. So we've got little bits of organizations, many undercapitalized. But if the goal is we want to triple, quadruple the number, size, and scale of Black-owned businesses in Cincinnati, if the goal is we want to make commercial corridors in Cincinnati, this is the work I've been doing with Laura, vibrant and vital, then what you need is some kind of alliance of these different institutions, more capacity for sure, to match where's demand coming from with where the businesses are located, help businesses scale up so they can meet the demand, give them access to quality capital. In theory, it's not that complicated, but it's no one's job actually to make the connections. Everyone tends to have a little piece of the puzzle. So we have little organizations doing what they do, and the matching is not happening at the speed or the scale it needs to happen. So that's what comes out of this. I don't want to minimize it, but I do think cities are networks. We're going to have to get better at networking. That's essentially the conclusion from all this.
I'm going to say two different things. So one, certainly, I think someone asked a question about how individual networks have a hard time communicating based on assumptions. And so where do you find that common ground? I mean, I think in many places, and cities included, that's your faith-based institutions. Those are your anchors that you're speaking to because you're all connecting in place. My work is focused on what we call community anchor institutions. So the same sort of sticky, resilient, infrastructure that people are hitting. That could be the corner. That can be somebody's park. It can be all these different things where you're going to get these sort of connection points. The question for me is, once you get into these spaces that make things a little more egalitarian, maybe it's a sports stadium, maybe it's a local bar, whatever that is, how do you create the infrastructure in there to have the same conversations? So you're networking the sort of solution points based on, an interesting sort of hyper local crowdsourcing effect. How can you sort of create a campaign or sort of that language where you're taking community informal leaders and maybe they're all whisper campaigning through their networks, right? Our project in Brooklyn, we're thinking about how do you create cultural preservation through space. The market was a 20-year-old marketplace that was built for informal Caribbean entrepreneurs. It was run by the city. My firm took it over about 4 years ago. We're building a new facility, but in that whole construct, the whole point of it's been preserving the sort of welcoming center that space is, because no matter why you're walking through the door, whether it's to make money, whether it's to sort of preserve the culture or move the culture forward, whether it's about this conviviality, being able to see your neighbor, having those spaces identified. Libraries are a great example of that. I heard a great term a couple of weeks ago. Relationship is the death of efficiency. I think we have to think about we're kind of pushing this idea of efficiency into our networks, and sometimes that's really important. But sometimes you want that friction to be able to sort of get that idea formed for sure. The other big piece I think is the moonshot concept we typically think about. We spend so much energy thinking about HQ2. So every city in this country, went nuts, right? It's pleasure trying to coordinate all these networks to answer a question for a company that may or may not even care. They just wanted your data, but you gave it to them, fine, right? But at the very least, every city I think that I worked with, and as a constellation, whether it was Detroit or New York or Philly, whoever, what they saw was the amount of talent and time and effort that you could pull together for something that everyone was clear on. That process was useful, right? In my mind, the question I asked every place I worked was, well, why didn't you do this for every other big civic problem you've had, forever, right? We're here now. We're talking about justice. We're talking about equality, all things that you kind of know are core problems. You can do it. You just have to have the bravery and the patience to be able to make that happen.
So tough question here. What's the role of city government and city leadership in this? We got an election coming up.
The real
it's not
power
just
of city government is elected officials. It's soft power. It's not hard power, because city governments only do a portion of what has to be done. And a lot of the power, actual power, lies in states or lies in counties. Cities are creatures of states in the US. In some other countries like South Africa, they're actually treated as equals to provinces and the national government. So in our country, they're creatures of state law. So the real power is the power to convene. The real power is the power to persuade, the power to bring different groups together, have the friction, have the battle, have the combat, but then ultimately break through to consensus around transformative action. So the best mayors in the country are not just having the trains run on time, though that would be good. I'm from Brooklyn, so occasionally that would be helpful. But it's really to focus the energies and galvanize the energies and inspire the energies of all these disparate players to solve the hard problems. Because at the end of the day, the federal government may regulate, they may invest, but the real problem solving has to be local, because places are distinct, their histories are distinct, their divisions are distinct. So it has to be local if it'll be sustained and be resilient over time.
I'll ask you quick.
No, go ahead.
Oh, again, sorry. I think city government particularly has two really interesting sort of batons that can sort of wield. One is its data. I think cities, when I watch cities that utilize open data platforms, the amount of solution points that come both from within and from without, so tend to accelerate pretty rapidly. And so, I've always felt like data is a disruptor of bias. And so, if we can dig deeper into, making better decisions in the city, and I'm thinking about public housing as a good example of that. There's been certain cities that have utilized their public housing roles to support credit reporting for low-income residents that are in their spaces. They have that sort of large, credible, but also scalable data set to give credit bureaus, progressive sort of opportunity points to sort of make something in everyday life effectual. I mentioned before where they're going to invest, and whether that's through pensions, like we mentioned before, pension funds, college savings accounts, their actual depositing accounts. Those are actions that definitely matter and can make a difference. And then in terms of just thinking about the larger identity around, justice in and of itself, cities making a stand, and I think you spoke to this around soft power, making a point of saying, this is what I care about, this is what my city cares about, we are going to move forward, whether we market it for the purposes of trying to attract tourists, talent, companies, this is what we're going to hang our shingle on, and really being clear about that. Those are reasons I think city government can be really effective in the game.
So let me
point about data.
Yeah.
Just to make a point about.
Yeah, go ahead.
Big data and machine learning and artificial intelligence is the redlining of today. And I think, we're now being affected by the ability of major institutions to say that part of town does not deserve investment. 100 years ago, there was actually a line. This time it's algorithms and parcel and block data. So city data has to counter these effects, because if they don't, the capital that is just sitting out there is not going to flow. And so we're living through a period of relentless technological advancement, which can have these pernicious effects, and no one even understands them, because it's basically a machine running the numbers. And so cities have to counteract the large and have the community speak for itself.
So you're saying cities and political power is counteracting. I'm kind of looking through some of the audience questions here. For instance, cities versus states. And Cincinnati, just like many other cities, is essentially a blue city in a fairly red state, let's put it that way. How do you think those dynamics will play out? What do you think the role of cities are in that? Is there a role for city governments there, or is that too concrete? Are we more looking at abstract networks in these relationships?
Well, again, where does city power lie? State power lies in state constitutions, right, which were enacted 150 years ago or longer. City power lies in market power, in innovation power, in the ability to cohere new coalitions to solve problems. It's not based in law. It's based in market and social reality. So that's the conflict now. And you could spend a lot of time trying to persuade state governments, but state governments are creatures of partisanship. So occasionally they'll come together, occasionally, right? But in the end of the day, cities are not fully leveraging their market and social power. They're spending a little too much time thinking about how states constrain them and not enough time thinking about how to unlock their full potential. So the die has been cast in the United States that we're going to be in a state of political friction for a long period of time. But investment will still flow to those places that have this agglomeration, concentration, co-location of assets. The question is whether they can be unlocked and leveraged for inclusive purposes. That's the only issue. If you depend on state government, we'll be waiting another 150 years.
So maybe just a follow-up question, and James, chime in by all means, right? So we have these networks, they're decentralized systems. How do we ensure that those networks have just outcomes? How do we ensure that those networks are not malice in their intent?
Well, I mean, I'll jump back to the other question, sort of bringing it together. I mean, who we elect speaks to what our values are. I mean, period. I mean, I think bottom line is if you don't want malice intent, you don't hire malice. You don't elect malice people. And I think it has to be a really sort of very basic two-pronged process. What are your values and how do you sort of inculcate talent to be able to sort of represent that in the public sphere? I think the idea of public service needs to be sort of reinvented from a marketing perspective, to be honest. Like we need a new set of tools to get, good-minded, good talented people to take that work on. Certainly I think from a ballot perspective, I'd love to see folks really pushing term limits in a way that's going to be much more robust at every level. Some campaign around that would make a ton of sense around justice. You can't get justice when you have entrenched power in place constantly. And I think in lots of these systems, you're seeing that happen. So you can't get that new energy in place. Beyond that, I think Bruce's point for sure around like the idea of regionalism, I think is really fascinating because I think there's always been this natural tension between suburbs and cities. When they are inexorably linked, it makes sense to be thinking about them as such. The tricky part, I think, even for Cincinnati, where you're talking about extra state relationships, that's really where I think the new economies are going to end up being built. It's going to be global and local. So when you think about what needs to be the sort of soft layer of not government, but government that has to happen in between, a real thoughtfulness around building that infrastructure up between region, and figuring out those moonshot issues and those sort of bread and butter issues that you can get, you get along to get along, but you figure out what those things are. And that's where you sort of, in my mind, make your hay. Because I think if you could do that, then you can start talking about like what makes the opportunity points just, right? Like you can't get to justice if you don't have the infrastructure to sort of build the just infrastructure to do it. Like trying to create justice on trying to build justice in like a slave quarter, it's hard. You know what I'm saying? I think a lot of these sort of entrenched infrastructure points that we have now all deserve re-examining. And if you're willing for government to make that work, then there's going to be certain ways to do that. But I think that the private sector, the institutional sectors that we're speaking to, they all play a role in that and advancing the ideas of what is just forward. And then I'm a big pilot person. I'm like, I'm very much lean manufacturing. Let's test some stuff out and see how they work in real time. So how do you invest in those baby moonshots in place and start pointing at things? So every politician I've ever met, they need to see that one pager that says these 3 projects are the things that we need to do at scale. Figure that part out. So figure out the innovation points that can speak to justice and start really thinking about how to inculcate things at scale from that point.
So James, Bruce, I'm going to ask an annoying question, which I think some of our audience members may have. How do we do this without any funding, especially state funding? How do we do this when states and the federal government essentially say, go take a hike, let's put it that way, drop dead, right? How do we make these bold moves? How do we make these networks? What do we do?
Well, hold on, let me bring this back down. A lot of what we're talking about is financed by markets, institutional investors, mixes of public and private, smart uses of public wealth. Let me just talk about Copenhagen, for example. Copenhagen 30 years ago was a devastated city. It had lost its manufacturing and it had lost its port to Malmo in southern Sweden. It was a dead city. And actually, most of the population had moved to the suburbs. And what it decided was to regenerate the core of the city and use the revenues from the regeneration to service the debt on a 21st century subway system. In the US, we tax to build subways. We use the sales tax, which is the most regressive tax, to build our transit. What they used was their public wealth. They understood that as they regenerated their city, because of zoning, smart land use, some incentives, the public had to take a piece of the action. The value could not just be totally privatized, right? There was a lot of profit created, right? And a lot of people made a lot of money, but the public kept a portion of the revenues and built a 21st century subway system. So, if we wait for the federal government or wait for states to get smart, game over. That ain't happening, So we have to get out of the US, stop thinking so parochially within our borders. We are very good at certain things. And to use the technical term, we suck at a lot of other stuff. So let's start, when all the money's gone, that's when you get creative. And there are examples in other societies that can be adapted to the US so that we can design, finance, and deliver transformative solutions. I don't think, we're thinking too much about the higher levels, a hierarchy, feds at the top, states in the middle, cities at the bottom. Cities are at the top. Cities are the apex of civilization. Let's start rethinking, shift the pyramid, and begin to rethink how we finance and deliver.
James, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly. I mean, to Bruce's point, cities are market driven and there's more market players and wealth, generators across the globe than just the ones in the government. The bottom line is a lot of private capital that still has a lot of money that made a whole bunch of money during COVID and they need to park it someplace. So, how do cities say, hey, we're open for business from that perspective? I think there's some realignment of existing capital that can be spoken to. Now, I might get some stones thrown at me since we're talking about universities here, but hey, you guys are sitting on a lot of fixed and liquid and fixed assets that, are worth a lot. And so, your relationship with the city vis-a-vis pilot, agreements and things of that nature can be rethought. We're talking about justice here. Oftentimes these institutions are sitting in communities that have been redlined, that have been disinvested in, and a lot of real estate not paying taxes for it. What do you want to do? Right. And so, I think you can squeeze some juice out of various lemons in that respect. And I think just reapportioning where existing debt may be going to sort of be generative in the first place. So if you're going to, shoot a bond out for infrastructure, well, I think back to my earlier point about non-accredited investment, can that water treatment plant that's going to have some revenue kickoff, can it actually be owned by the community? Is there a mechanism that you can create non-accredited investment portals for, muni infrastructure? So when a university like yourselves goes to the bond market and wants to build your next campus, well, if it's in that community, can there be a community note tied to that, right? And so I think there's ways, again, outside of the public sphere where money can kind of rotate here. So I'm super fascinated by these, this opportunity point where we're rethinking value, who holds it, who gets to determine what it is. Certainly, I think from a policy perspective, zoning's a massive thing, and people don't take nearly as much attention to it. You're going to tell me very clearly what's best and highest use based on how you zone a facility. And you go to a community that was industrial in its beginnings, and all of a sudden you upzone and create residential opportunities there, but you don't figure out how to deal with your manufacturers that you're automatically going to push up the second you make that decision, and you don't have a sort of runway for that thing. You're getting into a lot of trouble. So if you want to be smart about generating wealth through your zoning actions, you could be thoughtful with that community about, okay, what industries do I want to bring in? What kind of sort of 5, 7, 10-year runway do I want to make around investing in entrepreneurship in place? So when I make the zoning change, those are the businesses, those are the infrastructure elements that are going to generate wealth from within. And if you want to sprinkle on top of the outside stuff, great. But essentially you're tilling the soil ahead of time, and you're being really thoughtful about that and how that looks.
So let's bring this to a very concrete case study here. So one of the audience members, Gary, asked, how do we create a sustainable local food system? Let's just try this network. All right, so we have a network in place, or we should have a network in place, a sustainable local food system that supports minority-owned food entrepreneurs, growers, value-added producers, and retailers, and serve everyone in the neighborhood. Just an example here.
Right. I'll take a quick whack at that because we sort of are doing that in Brooklyn, knock on wood. So, there's an interesting set of products out there. So we don't talk about guarantees either. So in the banking system, there's plenty of opportunities to de-risk capital through guarantees. And so almost every agency has a guarantee program doing something. And so leveraging that, number one, could be an opportunity in places where, again, the value of the property, the value of the business may be shaky in the eyes of the folks who might be investing in it. So the USDA has a program called the B&I Community Facilities Guarantee. So you can basically guarantee up to 80% of that infrastructure through that loan. The loans are 2 to 3% for private developers and 0 to 1% for nonprofit developers to build out food hub infrastructure in place. And certainly a big piece of that is connect upstate or sort of wherever your upstate is, sort of rural connected product to downstate or urbanized marketplaces. So you're thinking about the local supply chain from that perspective. So you're able to use facility dollars to be able to help processing happen at whatever sort of local point you're going to make. You create your central node point for aggregation in the community. Then you can think about all that sort of great stuff that Bruce was talking about around anchor procurement, tying into the meals in the hospital, the meals in the sort of the corporate campuses, et cetera, and say, okay, now you have these big, you can get a contract with the city government to do X, Y, and Z with the hub, right? And then finally, you have a retail opportunity point that, if done, I mean, Finley's probably a great example of that. Finley's a hub in and of itself, right? And so the question is going to be, how do you get that minority, underrepresented folks in place around the supply chain? I mean, it's what we talked about before, is that network of technical assistance providers, capital providers, sort of the intermediaries that can sort of identify the talent, market the opportunity, and say, hey, look, there's a contract waiting for you. If you connect with US Foods or Aramark or whoever else, we will bully them into helping you figure out how to get into their slipstream. We'll use this hub that we just built to sort of create the value-added products, and then we'll move that out the door through multiple sort of channels. How long does that take? A good amount of time. How to coordinate? A good amount of effort. But it exists in place. There's models for it. And I think there's opportunity points to do things in places like Cincinnati that are super interesting here. I mean, I know Buffalo does some good things with urban ag and getting the Buffalo Niagara campus sort of byproduct in there. We've heard about Cleveland, 1,000 times about what they're doing through some of their co-op models, et cetera. So it doesn't like these models don't exist. It's really, again, going back to that, like who's going to coordinate the efforts, who's going to really sort of set up the opportunity points and sort of be the sort of leaders and champions to make it work.
I mean, look, at the end of the day, hold on, here we go. This is the end of the day, markets are demand and supply. That's all they are. They don't say to you, you have to buy the lowest price from a multinational corporation. They also, it's as fine to say buy local. It's as fine to say connect rural urban. It's as fine to say build up a whole new class of Black-owned entrepreneurs. I mean, markets basically are there to be manipulated and designed in the service of community. So it's demand and supply. And so I think at the end of the day, what are cities? Part of cities are about these large anchor institutions, eds, meds, corps, banks, utilities, who can decide we are going to buy more local and buy more Black and buy more sustainable. And the community itself will be stronger for it, and we will be stronger for it. It's a choice. The U.S. has made one choice for a long period of time. Post-COVID, we have the potential to make a very different choice, building on these examples. I need to get on a phone call.
Bruce, it's been nice having you. Thanks very much. James and I will take it from here.
Well, let me just see if I can hear you because it's.
Oh, sorry. It's been nice having you. Thanks very much for your time.
Take care, Bruce.
It's great to be with you guys. We should see each other in Philly.
Yes, we got to connect.
Yeah. Okay. Great to see
you around. So, James, let's continue the conversation here. So, you bring up especially some interesting points that we've talked about before, which is the unique culture of cities, right? So we had our guessing game as well, which I failed at. But we have this capital, you're right, capital is waiting to land. How do we use these unique cultures of cities to land some of this capital, which might just fly right past Cincinnati? How do we land this capital in a place like Cincinnati?
Yeah, I mean, I always think it's interesting about like, what are your subgroups? I mean, I don't know Cincinnati well enough, but like they're always sort of interesting diaspora that exists in place. It's usually when you think about businesses, the immigrant class tends to run the sort of baseline community businesses, and they tend to have networks upon networks that sort of fund those businesses. The sort of struggle with African-American business has always sort of been not having that same sort of network to tap into from a diasporic perspective. But those same diaspora create really interesting opportunities around highlighting who you are and showing a different side of yourselves, right? And so, being able to think about whether you're talking about just kids coming through the university, how do you retain that talent and keep those folks in place and get them excited about living in Cincinnati, owning a piece of Cincinnati, sort of adding to Cincinnati sort of growth and opportunity point. Or if you're talking about their parents, their, the financiers, et cetera, the folks that are looking at that kind of group and saying, hey, this interesting thing's happening in Cincinnati. We should be thinking about investing in it. That's one certain direction that can be really interesting. I think hopefully allow for different voices and different viewpoints to see kind of where Cincinnati's kind of going. But, on the flip side, I think, outside of the marketplace, the thing I mentioned before, the soft power of culture is a really, really fascinating thing. And you don't need to be one of these huge cities to be seen as a cultural driver. A good example, I think I see this, the Detroit back. We did a study about 2 years ago in Detroit with UNESCO. Detroit was the designated city of design in 2015. And we did a study with UNESCO and Design Corps of Detroit. And one thing that was really interesting about leveraging the city from a industry perspective, it was really over-indexed by, basically by 33 times in terms of the talent. Detroit had significant amounts of design talent, whether it was interior design, design in terms of engineering, design in terms of, software and computers, et cetera. It had this conglomeration of talent, but none of it lived in the city. it was all sort of migrating into the suburbs because it didn't have the sort of physical plant to sort of hold it, and it didn't have the companies to deal with it. So what was happening is that big companies in China, in the U.S., were basically all over the globe, were poaching cheap Detroit talent because of the soft power that it saw, as Detroit being a place where talent in the design world tends to conglomerate. So since there weren't firms in Detroit that could take advantage of that, you had national firms getting, frankly, cheap labor and frankly, undervalued cultural power from having a designer in Detroit working on my project. So when Nike wanted to put out a new campaign, they're like, oh, we got a Detroit team that's thinking about it. And so Detroit's gritty, Detroit's interesting. So they're moving that narrative through and monetizing it out. What I think is really fascinating now is thinking about popular culture, thinking about, kind of where we're going. Cities can control, and I mean, when I say cities, I mean individuals can control their own narrative at this point and create their own brand. Sort of neighborhoods can do the same thing. These sort of networks going up from that individual level all the way up, they have all these really great opportunities to think about how they express who they are, what that value is worth, and then there's more analytics than ever to be able to measure that value and potentially monetize it. But again, then you need support because creators don't tend to be the most business savvy folks in the world, but at the same time, like there's infrastructure for that, right? So I think part of this is like we're moving into a space where the new opportunities when you think about what industries exist. I mean, we talked about this on the phone before. We worked on a project doing a feasibility study for the hip hop museum that's coming online in a couple of years in the Bronx. And what was fascinating about that project was as we dug into what it meant to build a new museum from scratch, we had to figure out who had all the archival information, who had all the ephemera, who had all the actual beginnings of a permanent collection, who had the product. And it was community members who had things that, you didn't have a weight of value, right? And in typical collections, I mean, I'm speaking to the Mercantile Library, right? Like, how do you find the stuff, right? That's setting the culture now. How do you define how much that's worth? How do you remunerate people who have that stuff? Who gets the story tell? So all that stuff is all that soft power that if you can begin to create infrastructure around an industry for that. So who are the appraisers? Who are the curators? Who are the connectors to be able to sort of, facilitate capital in that space? These aren't new ideas. They're just new for where they're going, right? And so about cities, think about Cincinnati, I could keep coming back to like, all right, how do you sell yourself? How do you sell the culture and what you're doing is unique? You already have the talent. I already know it's there. They're already being poached because everyone already, again, you're cheaper labor. How do you bring that back home? And how do you begin to build the infrastructure to be able to create the sort of local economies that can be more generative for people that are here?
It's a great segue to one of our topics coming up in a couple of weeks on entrepreneurship and how to retain talent. James, I'm going to ask you a final question, and then we're going to round it up for tonight. It's a question from the audience that is getting a lot of votes. As Cincinnati has developed, so have countless parking lots, just like any Midwestern city, right? How important do you think public transportation is for the long-term growth of a city like Cincinnati? Talking about those networks, how important is movement?
It is hyper important. I think, I didn't do justice to the mobility slide that I put up earlier. Fundamentally, I think the cities that are going to win in the next 50 years are going to triple down on their public transit infrastructure. And it's not because we hate cars. It's about creating a multimodal network. And I mean, I think the woman who was introduced us in the first place is connected to the ports. When you think about mobility, it's every. Yes, Laura. Sorry. So it's mobility, and so having multimodal methods to get, Bruce's point, my point earlier, is moving ideas, moving infrastructure, moving capital. That's all tied to being able to move people. And talk about justice. That's always been the problem. You've had communities that have always been disconnected to the places that already have the infrastructure around skilling, around talent, around job creation. Those things are all connected. You've got to be thinking regional, 100%. It's how do you connect regional economies? How do you connect talent to other places that can, again, create those friction points that wouldn't happen anyway, right? How do you help that second stage business that's like just starting to creep up be able to get to a place that makes sense for where they are. Because sometimes you can't work in a hyper dense area. You need to be a little bit further away. We have to drive everywhere, have to build out all infrastructure. And again, for purposes of climate change, for purpose of talent, moving around talent. I think it's so basic in my mind. Mm-hmm. I think what it comes along with is a real sort of fear. I mean, you get very NIMBY at some point. You're like, well, wait, I don't want those bad elements, or I don't want that other group to come into my neighborhood or come into my space, right? And you start getting all the old tropes in place instead of thinking about fundamentally, if we're going to be able to compete and survive and be resilient, frankly, when you get these new system shocks that come in, you have to be able to move people and move stuff, right? We already have a pretty solid highway network. What we don't have is a public infrastructure to move people and to move ideas and to move talent and skill. And so I think doubling down on that has to happen.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, James. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us for the whole evening. So thanks also to you viewers, I guess, at home, right, for your questions and for joining us. We hope to see you back next month on October 28th, when my School of Planning colleague Vikas Mehta, who is somewhere in the chat here as well, he will discuss the importance of public space in cities with two international thought leaders on this topic, besides Vikas himself, of course. Be sure to check out all those other conversations we have. Remember our website, thecaseforcities.org. If you have registered, by the way, you're registered for all the conversations. You just use that same link and you're good to go. In the meantime, and James, I very much invite you as well to check out the conversations by the Urban Consulate, which focus on urban issues and opportunities, specifically with a focus on racial, class, and gender equity. Their next conversation on truth-telling will take place Monday, October 12th at 7 p.m. Check them out through the Mercantile Library or on urbanconsulate.com. Last but not least, I would like to thank my colleagues at the University of Cincinnati, the Mercantile Library, the Hale Foundation, and the Orville Simpson Center for Urban Futures for their support. In the background, I want to especially thank Amy Hunter, who has been messing with our audio and video and has made it work, who essentially has helped make this crowdcast run as smoothly as it could, right? If you want to see this conversation again, be sure to check out our website for a recording soon. And meanwhile, enjoy your Wednesday evening, and goodbye.